Welcome to this session. I'm going to just introduce a few people. My name is Helen Bocking. I'll be kind of moderating and trying to keep things on a time track today. We've got Dr. Payne, who is a researcher in biometrics. So he's going to be talking to us today. Cameron Niven, I hope I've said your name right, and I will apologise if I say any names incorrectly in this process. Lawyer looking at privacy law, I believe. We've got Catherine Easdon, who is a privacy engineer, who's joining us from the UK. We have microphone keeps dropping out, and I'm hoping and that's Buchhorn, and I've said that right. A software developer who's joining us from, a software developer from Bali, and we have Shivangi, who is a privacy and policy associate from India. So we're going to get started. And Ryan, why don't you tell us about some biometrics stuff, please?
Put our slides up. Yeah, so you can sort of see who everyone is going forward there. So I think the biggest thing is that people talk about technology and what's coming down. And I think that in the Internet Governance Forum, we talk about what's the infrastructure of internet and how we allow for access and equality and these kind of things. But one of the biggest things we're starting to see is actually the technology capabilities creating bandwidth issues, which then actually forces enablement and actually causes inclusion issues. Likewise, you see a lot of the different things that are coming through. On the top here, you see different fashion bases. So we've got a virtual reality, we've got an augmented reality, and then the gold is actually a Dolce & Gabbana dress for the virtual reality fashion show. And so these are things that have been available and are actually emerging technologies. But what you realize is that in different places in the Pacific Ocean, as well as in different government sectors, the bandwidth capabilities actually make a big issue for this. So we kind of had the idea is that would you give up technology, and also in the privacy context, a lot of people use these privacy things and don't actually realize what they're giving up. So we've put a few different technologies that are emerging here. Yes, this is the Woolies that I walk through. So you're watching me walk through a Woolies store, and this can actually augment and show me where to find frozen pizza late at night. It's very handy when you're walking through Brisbane if you want to be able to find out where things are. And yeah, that's me with a beard showing augmented reality or showing augmented humanization. When we talk about these things, if you think, why is that internet related? Well, imagine if your exoskeleton that you're wearing actually creates biometric data that can be harvested back to show your mobility or to show what you're doing in terms of heart rate. That actually allows for telemedication and telehealth to happen in different nations. If you work in a country or you're on an island that is significantly limited by the medical capabilities, this could be something to offer you, okay? So what we're going to be talking about then becomes biometric tracking technology systems. These are facial tracking, fingerprints, hand, palm, iris scans. They can also be physical or physiological attributes. I think people don't realize that your typing speed, or if the way you walk, the way we talk, the way this conversation is being recorded, are actually unique to each person. And unlike a password or a swipe card or something that you can be easily replaced, you can't change the way that you type or the speed in which you type and the process in which you type.
Thank you very much. You're happy to move on to the first area of facial recognition? And who would like to open this up?
So we sort of set up our panel to have different privacy experts and policy people. Obviously, I'm the biometrics person, so I've got the slides and talking about it. What this is actually, it's using CCTV cameras, and you can also use your cell phone if you want to go through. And this can actually recognize emotions, it can recognize intelligence, it can recognize IQ, it can recognize sexual orientation, and a few different things. I put out a paper in 2018, it was the highest cited paper, and it was GADAR. We fed 1.5 million people into a generative AI system, and fed 1.5 people who were anti-gay and anti-Semitic into a different system, and then had a computer go through and say, can you rank the person's sexuality? And with a 98% accuracy, will it predict their sexual orientation? You can imagine the Russian government inviting me to go to the Kremlin to go talk to them about this, right? It's an amazing opportunity. However, that allows for marginalization in a higher capacity we've ever heard of in the past, okay? So in that regard, we thought, what's the privacy and governance that's happening going forward? I know that this is significantly more advanced than potentially where we are in the Asian Pacific region, but if we don't talk about this now, how are we going to create the governance structures to actually implement it before it's already implementing? So we thought that this would be a good chance to sort of show these technologies and get impact from younger people who know the technology aspect with people who are more experienced in the policy aspect and the generative idea of it. So we wanted to go through some technologies, show you guys what they are, and then get feedback and try and develop policy and governance going forward that we can then take to Japan for the UN to adopt. So this is facial tracking. But I'm going to actually maybe let Kat or Shivangi or Katie, who want to maybe contribute a little bit as well.
Yeah, I might just quickly touch on what generative AI actually is. So it can complement this, what you've just presented. So basically, the focus of generative AI is on generating samples that capture the underlying patterns and characteristics of training data. So it could be images, text, audio, video, any kind of data. So in other words, the goal is to generate data that is to be as realistic as possible. And this is different from traditional machine learning, where the goal is to perform a specific task like classification or clustering, and then it's optimized to make accurate predictions or decisions based on the future. It might look like with biometric data. So suppose that you're watching a movie that's being generated in real time with biometric data as input. So imagine then if the movie adapts in real time, the data from your wearable devices or based on microfacial expressions. So maybe it can detect boredom and then generate more shocking content designed to retain your attention, basically designed to be addictive. To some degree, this is already happening with our social media feeds. But the question then becomes, what security measures do we need for AI developers and platforms? What's the ultimate goal? So with generative AI, it's tailored content that can be manipulated, that can manipulate opinions or can be exacerbated and create an echo chamber effect. So the one comment here is just that, and we'll get to policy development later, but transparency, but also how the platforms curate and deliver it and what their objective is, maximization. But as we shape policies, we need to prioritize mechanisms that break these information bubbles and ensure that we have exposure.
Yeah. Is that just an internet connection issue?
We've just got an internet issue. Can we just move to Kat? Would that be okay?
Sure, yeah. I think maybe to complement what Katie was discussing, we have this issue she mentioned where people are going to be manipulated by generated content that is adapting to, for example, their emotions. But there's the complementary concern of generative AI being used to fake something that somebody hasn't done or an emotion that somebody hasn't actually felt. For example, to go back to the detection of sexual orientation, for example, Ryan. Unfortunately, we're seeing a crackdown on LGBT plus rights in many countries around the globe. And if you imagine there is a system that is designed to report to the police who seems suspicious, if you could feed that fake data for enough time to get somebody flagged and arrested, even though actually that doesn't match the sexual orientation at all, that could be a major concern. Similarly, you could fake emotions, for example, to make somebody be detected as violent when actually they're not. There's all kinds of concerning possibilities with these systems if they aren't governed correctly.
I can jump in here if no one else is speaking at the moment. So just picking up from what Kat was talking about, right? I think it's also important to talk, moving away from generative AI a little bit, just talking about what facial recognition tech is used for at the moment, specifically by governments. I'm saying this because in India, we see that facial recognition tech is used by the government for multiple purposes. Surveillance, of course, is the most prominent one. So both for identifying and tracking prospective criminals, for tracing missing persons, especially children, but also for delivery of services from governments to citizens. One example, which I think is pretty novel, and I think it's there in some other countries as well, where at some of the busier international airports in the country, the government has implemented something called Digi at airport gates, which essentially allows people to use their face as a boarding pass for entering the airport, for security check. So yeah, that's one sort of use case. Even for delivery of vaccines during the pandemic, facial recognition tech was used by the government. So when I think about this, what this leads me to is 2 or 3 considerations, I think, which should be kept in mind when we're thinking of making recommendations to the government for using facial recognition tech. One is obviously the accuracy of the technology. It's pretty clear that facial recognition technology is not 100% accurate, and maybe in ideal lab-like conditions, there may be near accurate results. But in real-world conditions where pictures captured through, say, CCTV footage may be of low quality, unclear, in those cases, accuracy with which people can be identified or authenticating is a little low. That creates risks, obviously. The second consideration is really the proportionality and necessity in using this tech. Do the ends justify the means, really? Are existing systems that inefficient that it warrants deploying tech which is not entirely accurate, runs the risk of bias that others have pointed out, and ultimately invades the privacy of individuals in the absence of concrete safeguards around sharing this personal information. Finally, I think there's also the element of choice or consent. What I've noticed, not just in India, but globally, is that once this tech is deployed, these systems end up becoming de facto mandatory, though it almost always starts off as a pitch for convenience of citizens, convenience of consumers, the users in the case of the private sector. But ultimately, I think the choice to not have your facial data captured and processed by these systems, it becomes so inconvenient that people end up giving in for the sake of access to service and benefits. So yeah, I think these are a couple of considerations that we should keep in mind.
Thank you so much for that. Got to wait for the mic to work. Thank you very much for that. Do you want to move on to, or Cam, anything to say about that?
So as a lawyer, my role typically revolves around me coming in after the pieces have already fallen apart, trying to explain how my client's not liable and how it's everyone else's fault. But often we do get asked to provide, I suppose, feedback on the legislation as it's developing, and AI is a fantastic example, particularly as it relates to the weaponizing of AI. If anyone's been tracking the news recently, there are actually cases where a person's gait, it's not a very good microphone, being let down by the team. A person's gait has actually been analysed for the purpose of determining whether that person was a perpetrator of a criminal offence. Now, they didn't have that data prior to the commencement of a trial. They were effectively able to capture it and then rely upon it. So that, as a biometric data, goes to show exactly how influential your biometric data can be in terms of a criminal aspect. But then it also leads into a whole analysis of whether, as Ryan's indicated, tracking 1.5 million people to create a gaydar, whether you could spread that project out on an en masse scale for the purpose of analysing the perpetrators of crimes similar to pre-crime. And I think that's quite relevant in terms of the policy regulation around AI. For those that don't track these matters too closely in terms of the current policy position in Australia, there is absolutely no policy or legislation in place around the collection of your metadata, or your bio data. What we have in Queensland is a prohibition on the collecting of audio recordings of a person's voice through the Invasion of Privacy Act. In the other states, we have prohibitions on the capturing of a person's face unlawfully or for an unlawful reason when the person isn't provided notice. For example, you walk into a supermarket, they are recording you, you're aware of that, that is lawful. There's no policy or legislation on a Commonwealth level that speaks to the unlawfulness of retention of data. There is only the Privacy Act, which is untested in terms of its breadth, in terms of what must be done with that data, what it has been collected. So I think from a legal standpoint, it's going to be a very terse point as to how we begin to regulate metadata or biodata that could be used to steal identities inappropriately. For example, I don't know, track the progression of children for the purposes of scaling against other countries in terms of selling data. It's a pretty big concern, I think.
Yeah, and I think actually, moving on to the next slide, if we can. I think when we talk about DNA is actually sort of the next one. Is that sort of a lot of things that people don't realize is what your DNA can be used for. We think of, the stereotypical things like I'm going to get a blood sample. You think, and no one's going to come and take a blood sample from me in my remote island in the Pacific Ocean, right? That seems like you're safe. And so that's sort of ignorance is bliss, safety and capacity. But what people don't realize is actually palm prints and fingerprints and other things can be subconsciously captured. You ever take a high five photo or a peace sign photo, right? Looking at the room, some of you probably never have, but for my generation, right? What happens if a micro camera can go through and actually then use an augmented reality or a generative AI to actually predict your thumbprint or your fingerprints and then actually be able to capture those? It can be the best spy movie ever, but it can also be the invasion of your identity being lost. And I think that just building on what Cameron said, we talk about this DNA aspect. And what we're starting to see is companies like My Identity in Europe, and they're having children give a blood sample for identification. And the idea is a safety and security aspect. So give a sample of your children's blood, and then if ever there's an issue, the police can identify that child, know who they are. We can test for any genetic informalities. We can check for any health concerns, any considerations. And they're creating a giant depository then of every single person's blood. And so in one capacity, we capture it with for safety and security. However, that can be used in malicious capacities going forward. Yeah. Maybe I'll let Kat and Shivangi and Katie chip in a little bit on that.
You touched on this a bit before, Ryan, but I would like to illustrate this point a bit further because I think it's really important. But so biometric DNA data is particularly sensitive data because, like you said, unlike passwords, if this information is compromised, we can't reset our biometric features. And also they are uniquely attributed to each individual, whereas perhaps before we collect data at more of an aggregate level like age, gender, etc. But now we have uniquely attributed data. So storing and transmitting this data has all of a sudden become more high risk because if it's not properly anonymized, this data can then be linked to other personal data. So thinking about our social media profiles, addresses, financials. So what we could potentially have is a very comprehensive profile of an individual, which could then, of course, be exploited. So thinking about what we said before about extreme targeted advertising or information bubbles or impersonation, identity theft, or even just something like unauthorized access to our own personal systems.
Katie? Kat, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would like to quickly refer to one of the questions in the chat, just to go back to this idea of data being faked or manipulated to falsely implicate a person, whether that's facial data that we're faking, genetic data, I would say is harder to fake because typically there is more information in there to fake. We have sort of a hierarchy of how easy it is to generate fake data, with voice samples being quite straightforward. Facial data is harder. I would say genetic data being the hardest, but it is plausible that genetic data could still be fake. So yeah, to go to Andrew's point, will that make a reasonable doubt defense more necessary, more available? And to what extent will privilege and disadvantage make such defenses available unequally? I think that's a really great point. And I think education is going to be absolutely crucial here, both of the general population and also the legal profession, in the same way that we have some legal precedents established that, for example, polygraph data isn't 100% reliable. I hope that we will eventually get to a point where we see biometric data as complementary evidence, but not sort of conclusive evidence to prove that that some action did take place. So it's suggestive that perhaps that happened, but I hope we could get to the point where it's not sufficient to prosecute somebody. You would also need additional evidence in order to make that case in court. Perhaps Cameron, would you chip in on that as well?
Fantastic. I'll pass it over here.
Yeah, for sure. So I did touch on it briefly. There are cases and precedents where a person's biomarkers or biological data have been used for the purposes of establishing that a person was in a place. It's always sort of, I guess, impossible to determine what a court will do. But in circumstances where there is a lot of evidence and information which leads an inference that something did happen, that's always going to be persuasive. Ideally, we would want to see, I guess, false positives, particularly as it relates to how someone walks, as it relates to their culpability of committing a crime. But that's yet to be determined, I suppose.
And so I think that kind of brings us into the next aspect, which is, if we get the slide up, is actually in voice recognition. This is actually harvested typically from wrong calls. So when you actually have someone call you and there's no line there and you go, hello, hello, can you hear me? Right? Within 3 seconds, roughly, I think I put it down there, using ChatGPT or other large language model systems, within roughly 3 seconds of talking, you can actually get all the sample lights you need to actually then be able to produce someone's voice to then manipulate going forward. And one of the things we're starting to see, I love that shift in the room. You could see everybody literally just shift the discussion. So you can see why this is very important to talk about, is that one of the things we think about is in terms of internet governance, is that the internet now allows for this harvesting of information. And so as a infrastructure, how do we govern the flow of information as well as the sources in which it comes from? I think it's one of the things we talk about why it's appropriate at this conference is sort of what does that mean in capacity buys? We have APrIGF is one of the people who are hosting a seminar Thursday morning as a breakfast. Their IP addresses. And you think, oh, IP addresses, that's easy. That doesn't matter. It's simple. But if you can recognize the IP address or where something comes from, you can actually profile the IP address and what the preferences are. So you can then link that with other information and say, that always goes to that person's Facebook, or that goes to that situation. Someone's laptop also goes to that same Facebook. We can link those together and then track the flow of information for double authentication. So when your bank sends you a confirmation code, it can actually be tracked through server systems. I think that's one of the things that people sometimes don't recognize. And your voice then to authenticate that, recognizing someone's telephone calls, talking about the flotsam and jetsam of the day, could then be used to say, hi mom, oh my gosh, I forgot my social insurance number and I'm applying for a job. Can you send that? Can you send it to me? Or, hi mom, oh my gosh, I'm overseas or I'm at an amazing conference. I don't have enough money. Can you send me money? Right? I tried it with my mom. I said, hi mom, I need this new Prada pair of shoes. Can you send me money? Didn't go so well. Yeah. But I think that sort of that idea, general crowd control and sort of authentication via voice, there's a lot of different aspects here. We're starting to see that now with generative AI and what that can mean. Yeah. So I'll pass it to the amazing ladies online to talk about that. I don't know if Katie or Kat want to go first.
All right, I'll keep the same order as before, I guess. So I like voice recognition. This is one of my favorites because I think it holds the promise of enhancing user experiences because it provides a really natural and convenient interface, and it enables access for a diverse range of technology users. But on the flip side, it can reveal quite sensitive information about an individual, as Ryan said, even unintended cues like emotion or health conditions. So I'll give an example of a health condition. This is an active area of research at the moment. Voice tracking and acoustic analysis has been shown as a potential screening tool for early diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. If you don't know that, it's a progressive neurological disorder that affects movement and control. And actually changes to voice characteristics are so subtle they might not be detected by the human ear, but of course we have technology now that can analyze and identify these subtle changes before the motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease become apparent. So this is just one example of how voice tracking can reveal extremely sensitive information about a person for which the person themselves might not even be aware. And as you can imagine, this would be quite upsetting to discover. So do we need to train our algorithms to have, bedside manner? Because this is the kind of information that usually a doctor would deliver. And it could be, this comes to the question of who's actually collecting and running that data of you and running those algorithms, because it could be that your workplace has these recorded phone conversations or anyone that has called you and recorded your voice and then access to this algorithm. So it could be that someone else is aware of your health condition and you are not. And I'll finish there.
I think the positive side of this, the accessibility aspect, is really important. My background is in security, and so I tend to go for the paranoid, oh, everything's terrible, it's all going to be hacked viewpoint. But the positive benefits of this technology is also really, really important, and we need to strike a balance, right, between utility and privacy. So, for example, I struggle using a mouse. I have a long-term wrist injury. As an engineer working on a computer all day long, I do use the mouse all the time. But a voice-controlled interface, for example, if it could be an effective one, that would be life-changing. So I wanted to pause for a second before I go back into paranoid mode to acknowledge that these technologies are also absolutely brilliant. And governance, when we're thinking about governance concerns, we want to make sure we aren't too heavy-handed and too restrictive in limiting the innovative potential of these technologies. All right, paranoid hat back on. Something I wanted to touch on with voice recognition is perhaps obvious when you stop to think about it, but it's the fact that in order to enable voice recognition, we need microphones everywhere. And this is something that you can't really opt out of anymore because everyone is carrying a smartphone with them. Many people are wearing smart watches as well, also have a microphone on. So the challenge of consent becomes really concerning when we see how little of your voice needs to be recorded in order to fake your voice. You can't opt out of this just by opting out of these technologies yourself, because you're surrounded all day long by people who are using these technologies. So that is challenging to navigate, and it means that we need to keep individuals' collective privacy in mind, because a security mitigation that's deployed onto somebody else's device is actually helping protect you as well. So we all sort of have a shared interest now in protecting each other's devices, essentially, and encouraging each other to follow good practices with the devices that we're carrying with us. I'll hand over to Shivangi.
Thanks. I think I'll continue with your paranoid hat, because I think when I think of AI generated voice tech, I'll build on what Ryan was talking about earlier about how easy it is to capture voice samples without consent, and to then have AI generated voice tech being portrayed as a natural person. There are, I think, legal implications of this, but also social implications, which is, I think, what Ryan was talking about, which is social engineering frauds, right? So the possibility for something like this to commit fraud is really high. And also for this to have financial implications then for individuals, because in India, at least, and also elsewhere, there are proposals to implement voice-enabled payments. something that, at least in India, we're calling them conversational payments. So with the advent of generative AI and this, enhanced ability to create voice samples which sound like a person, what does that mean for financial frauds and how do we act against that? I think that's an important conversation to have. In terms of social implications, there's obviously the ability to spread misinformation online. So we've seen content come up which is AI generated, which is pretending to sound like a politician or the president of the country. What does that mean for a society? What does that mean for political misinformation spreading, say, for example, during an election campaign? Another, I think, legal implication, obviously, I think Cam might be able to shed more light on this, would be the copyright and intellectual property implications of this. I think there have been researchers who pointed out the ability for this sort of technology to, cause mayhem in that scenario. So yeah, I think these are a couple of nuances in this topic that we can think about more.
Yeah, that's entirely correct. So just to add to that, Ryan and I are a whole conversation about the property ownership of data once it's been created, and then the tracking or the recording of that data as being owned by a separate party. So currently in America, this is actually a key issue because we have all of these voice actors from I think they're from Star Wars who have had their voices cloned by Lucasfilm, and they've gone ahead and made further TV series, and the actors don't get paid for it. So that does raise the exact question of, is my voice copyrighted upon my creating it, or is the data now owned by someone else who then registers that, and they effectively own my voice despite the fact it is inherently my own.
And that kind of takes us to our next slide there. Thank you also for forwarding it ahead. I appreciate that. Wearable tracking devices, in sort of this idea that we have these abilities. And one of the reasons why we specifically focused on this, we could have talked about a lot of different biometrics, but we specifically picked wearable tracking devices because in the Asian Pacific community, we think that what will happen is that they'll use the adaptation of telehealth to then advocate, great, everyone start wearing a health watch, start wearing these things, let's allow for your health, remote access to health, but that there's not going to be the governance structures to protect what happens with that information and with that data going forward. So here at this conference, we thought that there's a really big need then to actually try and draft policy or to advocate for policy to protect against that going forward. If you look online, I've got a lovely graphic that I made yesterday and during the seminars. So, everyone probably thinks about their wearable watch, their Apple Watch that they wear, going forward with it, right? I can see people wearing them, holding them up. That's great. I think one of the things people don't necessarily realize is smart clothing. One of the things is Levi's, if you know the jeans company, actually now puts magnetic threading into their jeans. So you can actually then rubbing your pants can actually charge your cell phone, which seeing people going to, it is a whole situation there. We're not going to talk about that. I think that the GPS aspects, one of my favorite stories is someone asked me about what does this mean in a military context? And if you're in the military, you have a big thing where you put your cell phones, and you're in a secure location in Afghanistan. And these guys would then go running because they're Navy SEALs and they're going running and they're wearing their Fitbits. And so an organization would track the Fitbits of the soldiers and then say that it would, when they could see the soldiers run and they'd be like, haha, that's great. And you can read online, it's actually, there's on WikiLeaks, there's actually commentary on the running abilities of the soldiers. And then they would go into a black zone. And you're right, there was no internet communication there. The IP addresses were secure and everything was there. But it was pretty simple to understand that that's where the military base is. And so they're able to track where all the different US military bases are. Likewise, on a submarine in the South Pacific Ocean, it's now come out that they can actually create the entire layout of one of the new submarines because of the acoustic recognition of everybody wearing smartwatches or communication devices. So there's a lot of different aspects there. The flow of information, traffic flow. If you come from a city where trying to avoid traffic, so you use waves and a whole bunch of other different systems. One of my favorites is that during a PhD defense, a very kind gentleman took 45 cell phones and put them in a little wheelbarrow and walked across a bridge, because that then he was going super slow. 45 cars, quote unquote cars, showed that there was a big traffic jam. So everyone in the city avoided it. And his daughter then could drive straight across that bridge. No problems, no issues. So you're starting to see a gamification aspect of this going forward as well. So I'm going to let everyone get in and talk about what this means going forward. So I'll pass, I'm changing up the order. Maybe we'll let Kat go first, so Katie can have a chance not going first.
Okay. So in terms of wearable devices, I have a case study that I would like to share with the room, and I'd be very interested to hear your opinions on this. And for me, it really illustrates how important it is for designers of these products to try and get a wide range of opinions about their products. So there is a smart ring, I'm wearing it now, called the Oura ring, which has similar capabilities to a smartwatch that you might use to track your health. It tracks your temperature, your pulse, your blood oxygen levels, and it has really cool potential to change the world of work. And the company decided they were going to launch a Slack integration. It generates a score that calculates sort of your readiness based on how much you slept that night, your temperature, whether it looks like you're getting ill or anything. And their idea was that people could share this with their colleagues and they would feel more connected. People might voluntarily offer to rearrange meetings if they could see their colleague wasn't doing very well. And it could also reduce illness in the workplace, which is really cool, right? A lot of people have been reluctant to get back into the office after the pandemic, because now we're much more aware of how diseases are spreading in these environments. So it would be great if we could skip flu season completely, because everybody's ring tells them, hey, you're coming down with something before they're even symptomatic, and they can just stay out of the office, protect everyone else. So they saw this as a hugely beneficial thing. And crucially, they only gathered feedback within their company. So they interviewed people who were already super enthusiastic about Oura because they work for the company. And they all gave a thumbs up to this feature and said, like, yeah, this is amazing, let's ship it. And then the feedback that they got from the general public and their users was so overwhelmingly negative that they had to withdraw the feature, unfortunately, because people just found it creepy. So I'd be really interested to do a quick poll of the room. Would you like to see this at your workplace? Like, what chance of never having flu season at the office again weighed against the creepiness factor? What do people think? Hands up if it's creepy.
It's two-thirds of the room, I would say. Who'd be up for it? Show of hands. Yeah, I'm up for it. Sure. Only a few. Interesting. Thanks for that. Shivangi, do you want to?
I think one thing which I've been reading about in this sort of domain, which is really interesting to me, and I personally think that seems like it's the next sort of frontier of wearable tech, is neurotechnology. And I think it was just a couple of months ago, earlier this year, where Neuralink got the approval from the FDA in the US to conduct in-human trials. So I think this is an area that is often not talked about, and I acknowledge that, maybe I'm just, being, like Kat mentioned earlier, just too paranoid before anything has actually gone wrong. But I think the potential for harm, or the risk of harming with this particular type of tech is really, really high, because it's harvesting brain data, and we don't have a complete understanding of how it can be used. But in terms of policy here and what can be done about it, I have a really good example from Chile. I think personally what they've done is great. They have a neuro rights agenda, which is really interesting to me, because they have essentially carved out a right to mental privacy in their constitution. And they're the first country to do that, where they have given their citizens the right to have non-discriminatory access to neurotech, but also constitutionally guaranteed that individuals will have the choice in whether or not they want to adopt neurotech, use it. Then what this essentially means is it's sort of a technology agnostic and a future-proof foundational step to ensure that when and if this technology actually becomes commonplace, where consumers have ready access to it, like they do to smartwatches or an Oura Ring at the moment, then at that point they have that right protected beforehand. So I think that's neurotechnology and how self-determination and privacy will apply in that context as this tech develops. So I think that's really interesting to me, and I would love to hear more about it from the panelists or from the room.
Thank you very much. And Katie?
I'll just very quickly add that the collection of this type of data in particular is quite exciting from a mathematician's standpoint, because I don't really think that we've come that far in modeling the human body as an entire system. And I think there's huge opportunity to, down to the cellular level, generate a digital twin of ourselves. And once we can do that, once we have a model of something, of course, we can generate scenarios, we can perform an optimization. So imagine kind of like a performance optimality online version of yourself. I think the potential here is very exciting. But of course, the risks as stated above. I just wanted to quickly mention that I'm quite excited about wearable devices and the data that's generated from them. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And our final topic is about policy development. Who wants to take it first? I'm going to pass to Cam, actually.
So as I did mention before, there is effectively no significant policy in Australia which working. Nothing, guys.
I think the power just went out there.
To lectern the energy.
That one working? Yeah, okay. Maybe prep the lectern just in case. Oh, there. Is this going to work? No. Yeah. It's on. Okay. So there is no strict policy in Australia that speaks to the collection of biometric data. There is policy that speaks to the storage of the data, particularly through the Privacy Act and the Australian privacy principles, but that doesn't expressly deal with what happens with that data is actually disclosed. So in that sense, there is a very, very big gap in the legislation. In 2019, there was a bill passed through Parliament, which effectively fell over due to overwhelming lack of support, which proposed to allow government entities to store and trade with each other in mass all of your biometric information, which was obviously unpopular for obvious reasons, but it was inconsistent with the ICCPR, the International Convention on the right to maintain bodily privacy. The problem with that argument is that that ICCPR doesn't necessarily speak directly to the collection of your data. It only says that your body can't be interfered with unlawfully. In collecting your data, they're not actually interfering with you. As Ryan mentioned earlier, they could take your palm print from a photo. You have been dealt with or touched on or in connection with your person at all. So in terms of all of the issues that we've discussed today, from the copyright of your voice, the ownership of your biomarkers in your DNA, I think all of these things need to be sort of quite strenuously regulated to ensure that, to a standard, I suppose, that your biodata is treated much the same as your fingerprints. You can't walk into a police station and say, hey, give me Ryan's fingerprints. It's only released for a lawful purpose as consent or upon a court order.
I'm going to, just in the interest of time, quickly pass to Katie and then to Captain Shivangi, just because we have about 5 minutes left for everyone to get through. So I'll let you guys quickly contribute policy.
Yeah, okay. So from a software development perspective, let me just say that biometric data that's collected for one purpose, like authentication, could potentially be repurposed without consent. So if we think about the pipeline, so AI involves a number of systems under the hood. So building software involves this pipeline or combination of systems from the data that's actually collected via some camera, maybe device. Then it's stored on some platform, which might be separate to this collection mechanism, which then might be downloaded and analyzed on another platform. And then the question is, once it's analyzed, where do the outputs go? Are they generated images that are uploaded online, for instance? And by this stage, with the data that's the output data, have we actually ensured anonymity? Because it won't necessarily ensure that unless the algorithm's been specified to do so. So in terms of policy, I think we should ensure that users have a clear understanding of how their data is used and give them, this is important, the right to opt in or control their own usage. Because ensuring this control over how particularly biometric data is used is quite complex. But again, I think it's important to develop these mechanisms to allow individuals to grant and revoke consent and to control the scope of how it's used, which also ties in education, which was mentioned before. So educating users about the potential for what this data is used for can really empower them to become more conscious consumers of online content. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the individual privacy rights are really crucial. And I would say I'm very hopeful that we'll see the EU AI Act setting a precedent here in terms of establishing biometric rights in the same way that we saw it establishing precedent for individuals' privacy rights. But from the engineering perspective, unfortunately, there are still so many companies that, although they're subject to the GDPR, aren't actually compliant with it. So we have this challenge of bridging the gap between the legislation and actual enforcement of it. Already with the GDPR, the data protection authorities aren't empowered, as they don't have sufficient resources to actually follow up on all of these cases. Often they don't have incentive to. We see in the case of Ireland, for example, there are so many tech companies based there, and it's hugely beneficial for the Irish economy. So they are not incentivized at all to enforce the GDPR, and this has been causing a lot of scandals lately with the Schrems case, as I'm sure some of you are aware. But hopefully the EU AI Act is at least a step in the right direction. So that will be establishing a full ban on real-time biometric surveillance, emotion recognition, and predictive policing systems. So on the policy side, I'm hopeful for that. Something I would like to end with is, from the engineering perspective again, there is no such thing as perfect security. So either when you're thinking about your own personal biometric privacy and trying to establish what you personally are or are not comfortable with, and also when we're thinking more broadly about policymaking, we should always start from the assumption that this data will be leaked eventually. People make mistakes when they're coding. There are new zero-day vulnerabilities, things get hacked. We should always start from the premise that, okay, someday this data is going to be leaked, and what are we going to do then? How are we going to provide for a way to revoke this method of authentication, for example, so that individuals can protect themselves from identity fraud? So I'd say for me, that is the core thing to keep in mind. We cannot assume that we can keep these secret forever, because for all the reasons that we've covered already, right? Just 3 seconds of voice footage is enough to fake your voice. I'd hand over to Shivangi.
Thanks. I'll pick up on a point that Katie mentioned, which was about controlling or defining the scope for which biometric data is used and how this can be done through policy. I think in India, at least, I think we're one of the only countries where we have this huge database, which is called the Aadhaar database, where the government essentially collected the biometric information of citizens, fingerprints, iris scans, and all of this was sort of tied to a unique number. I think an equivalent in the US would be the social security number, right? And this is the number that you use for accessing a bunch of things. It's linked to your bank account, it's linked to your passports. It's really an all-encompassing way of like profiling citizens or delivering services to them, whichever way you choose to see it, the optimistic way or the pessimistic way. But I think now the scope of this is, at least in India, this is being expanded, where earlier the use of biometric data was restricted to government using it for giving services to citizens or for just general governance purposes. But now there's also an inclination to let businesses use this for something called ease of living, which ties back into the earlier point that I was talking about, which is where do we draw the line of technologies becoming de facto mandatory. So I think from that perspective, it's important. One of the important policy goals is to define the scope for which biometric data can be used, who can use it, and for what purposes. The second thing that I think policy and law will have to deal with is whether existing data protection laws in the Asia Pacific region are sufficient to deal with the very nuanced sort of concerns that arise out of biometric data. I say this specifically because in India, we saw a Data Protection Act finally being enacted earlier this month, but there is no specific definition of biometric data or sensitive personal data for that matter. So what does that mean for data protection laws or data protection authorities being able to regulate on these issues? And is there a need for a different or a specific policy intervention to come in just for this, just for addressing these concerns? I'll end there.
So if we can just bring up the last slides here really quick. I know we're bang on for time. We're trying to make sure we get through. We knew that we had a lot to get through. So we wanted to be able to get your feedback. So we've actually put a QR code up. This is my LinkedIn to get your guys' feedback. Everyone we've connected built together. So we thank everyone for coming forward. We put a few questions in there, but feedback, ideas. If you have an idea for governance and policy, Catherine and I are actually Internet Society and Shivangi are early career fellows. So Kat and I are going to be speaking at IGF, going into much more detail about this and talking about the generative AI aspect a little bit more. So we'd love to get your feedback for policy development. So if you could email or give feedback, come talk to us outside in the hallway. But also, thank you very much for being here. We really appreciate you guys putting time and effort into coming and showing support for this new emerging technologies. So thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
I just want to finish off by thanking all of our speakers today. So thank you, Ryan, for organising this. Thanks, Kat. Thanks, Katie and Shivangi for joining us overseas. And thanks to Cam as well for giving us the legal aspect. Can everybody just join me by giving us a round of applause? Thank you.
Right. Up next after lunch in the same room, that would be at 2, is breaking security for online safety, what's at stake for Asia Pacific. And I believe lunch will be outside. So if you have questions for panelists, feel free to ask them up here or, outside when you're grabbing refreshments. But do remember to come back to the room at 2 because we have exciting program for you still.